Hello, and welcome to this little introduction to the shrine. I'd like to speak about the shrine from two angles. One is understanding the nature of the shrine, you could say the view of the shrine, and the other is more the practice, having a shrine, and you could say the daily interaction with the shrine. Now, of course, first of all, we need to realize, or we recognize that the shrine is something that we practically don't really have in our modern culture. It's something that falls outside of the parameters of what most of us know. Of course, except we might belong to a particular religious denomination in which you have a church and you go to worship God and so forth. But the Buddhist shrine is a little bit different. And also in general, the way that the shrine is understood in Asian cultures is quite different. So for example, in Japan, you have shrines in the house that are not particularly necessarily Buddhist, but nevertheless represents what's sacred to that particular family, to the particular persons living there. And that's where you might have a shrine dedicated to the ancestors, or in some way something that represents what is sacred. And the thing about the modern person very often is that there's not really anything sacred in our lives. The dimension of something that's higher is very often misunderstood, and very often something which we assume only exists on the basis of faith or superstition. And that's of course where we Buddhists, we're very different in that regard, because everything that we're doing is really based on our observation and what we can verify. And that's where we can very clearly verify that our mind has the potential for both samsara, confusion, as well as nirvana, freedom from confusion. So that's where the Buddhist understanding of the shrine is very much based on something that has to do with our immediate experience. So I'm going to just base this on a little sort of short essay I wrote and shared with some friends, and I'll just sort of unpack it as we go along. So the first part, the nature of the shrine. A Buddhist shrine honors the awakened nature the Buddha realized, a luminous, unconfused essence present in all beings. So that's also where we're approaching the shrine, of course, with recognition of the Buddha as the teacher, but also as the one that represents our innate natural disposition. So just as a teacher is not a savior, then also the Buddha is not going to just magically help us if we have a shrine, but it's more that the Buddha represents our potential, what we truly are. So across spiritual traditions, shrines of all kinds represent a truth, something greater, beyond self-centered concerns. And that's where, of course, for most of us, we have a humble recognition about how our ordinary, neurotic, self-centered mind operates. And that's fair enough. It doesn't mean that we're necessarily ultimately bad people. But at the same time, it's really necessary for us to connect with what is beyond that. And that's what we do with the path. That's where we're proactive in doing something that takes us out of a sort of a small place and into something greater. So engaging with a sense of higher truth beyond our ordinary self-centered mindset fosters humility, tempers the ego, and inspires an opening up to an experience of a greater dimension of our intelligence, what we call wisdom. So that's where the shrine represents something that is present in our life. It's vivid. It's something that is in the landscape of our home. We might not have it where everybody comes, but then again we might. But regardless of where we place it, it's something that's there and represents something greater. And that's a reminder of what we truly are. And that's also where it inspires us to be more than we sort of ordinarily, the ordinary patterns that we normally are caught within. Now, there's an important point. Unlike theistic worship, a Buddhist shrine is not devoted to an external deity. It reflects our own sacred potential, our Buddha nature. Through physical and verbal practices such as bowing, offering, and chanting, we engage body, speech, and mind in a direct experiential connection with this innate dimension of being. So the Buddhist shrine, like I said before, is not about something that's beyond us and actually you could say separate from us, but it very much represents what you could say is truly our nature. And that's what we connect with, and that's where the shrine is not just something that sits there as an object, but it's there really as something where we connect with the sacred dimension, and we do so where we open ourselves up with respect. We make these offerings that we might make: flowers, water, incense, whatever it might be, light. And that's not separating ourselves. It's actually interesting. It actually dissolves the divide between us and our Buddha nature. So it's important, especially in modern contexts, to distinguish this non-theistic approach from worship. It's important, especially in modern contexts, to distinguish this non-theistic approach from worship that reinforces separation between the sacred and the self. So that's where very often we're used to assuming that when we have something that represents the sacred, as we have it in some religious contexts, then there's strong separation between oneself and the god or the deity or whatever it might be. And as one Tibetan teacher pointed out, it seems that sometimes people, the more they sort of put themselves down, they think that this is what is an expression of their devotion or their respect for the divine. In the Buddhist context, it's the exact opposite. The shrine serves as eliminating, dissolving that divide between oneself and the awakened condition. So that's where bowing to the Buddha is an expression of respect and opening, and it facilitates then connecting with that dimension of wisdom, selfless wisdom as it abides within ourselves. So that's a little bit about the nature of the shrine. And then on a practical level, if we have a shrine, so it's very important that we don't just leave it as some sort of like decoration or some sort of a statement about our identity and so forth. In some way, it's valuable to have a statement about the fact that our world is not dominated by this narrow idea that there's nothing beyond this life, that there's nothing sacred in our existence and so forth. And in some way, a shrine is a statement, but it should more than anything be a statement to ourselves. So an encouragement for us to practice the path. But it defies this dogma that very often rules the modern person, that there's nothing except just, what you can sense and what you can experience in this life, and there's nothing beyond that. As we know from our own experience, we have the potential for falling into both confusion and also freeing ourselves from it. And also, the more that we study the Buddhist teaching, we also realize how much the world is created on the basis of our habitual, specific disposition, our habits, and so forth. And that's where we understand that we very often are caught within a very narrow view of our reality. And the more that we actually begin to investigate our assumptions about this reality, we begin to see that it's not as fixed as we think it is. So that's where, on the basis of listening to the teaching and reflecting on it and taking ownership of the teaching, we begin to appreciate something that goes beyond just our ordinary assumptions. And within that, then beginning to appreciate a dimension that is not contaminated by confusion. And that, of course, is then the awakened condition that we refer to as the Buddha nature. And this is the awakened condition that the shrine represents. So our relationship with the shrine should be one really of a very living experience of continually connecting with this ultimate dimension of what the nature of reality is. What is the nature of phenomena? What is the nature of our experience? So, in the cultures in which this is a living tradition, experience, where it's not just a dogma or not just some sort of cultural practice, but where it's something that really constitutes the most insightful understanding of the nature of reality, then the shrine is found all across the culture. And you can, of course, see how in Buddhist cultures you have shrines everywhere. It can be sort of big shrines, temples, and so forth, but it can also just be along the roadside, shrines across the roadside, which you also actually have in typically Catholic countries. But all of this really is serving as something that continually brings us back to this insight. And so we have it there in Buddhist countries. It says shrines are integral to Buddhist life, found in temples, homes, and public spaces. In the Buddhist tradition, a shrine typically includes the objects of veneration, so that's the representations that we have, the symbols of enlightened body, speech, and mind, such as statues, scriptures, and symbolic images. Now here I'm a little bit coming from the Indo-Tibetan tradition. I'm not sure all traditions actually work with this, but in the Tibetan tradition, the shrine in generally referred to as chösham, which means where you arrange the offerings. But the offerings, they are made to the object of the representations of body, speech, and mind, what we call tensum. And the tensum means the three supports. The support of the body, which is typically then the what we have as images, like here in the Tanka, the Buddha statue, the pictures of teachers and so forth, deities and so on. And then you also have the symbols. That's the representation of the body, but then you have the representation of speech, which typically would be a book. So, you might have a book of some sort. Like here I have a small book behind the Buddha statue. And that represents the Buddha's speech. And then you have the representations of the Buddha's mind, which could be a stupa or crystals or vajra and so forth. So here it's represented by the tsatsa, that is, represents the stupa. One needn't necessarily have all these, and simply just having a Buddha statue, that's also completely fine. But that's what we then refer to as the ten, or the support, and that's then the object of veneration. Then you have the offerings, and that's where you could have water, as you have here. This is a very traditional setup with water. You have light, you have incense, and so forth. And this, of course, we arrange carefully. Sometimes we would talk about the auspicious conditions that it creates when we make these offerings. Of course, it's something in which we accumulate merit, in the sense of we create conditions for facilitating connecting with the path and the accomplishment of the path. And also, you could say, achieving the positive conditions for ourselves and the world in general. But that's where sometimes there's some traditional instructions on how to arrange the water bowls or the offerings and so forth. And above all, really, what's emphasized is really that it's something that we do with inspiration, with a lively engagement, so that it's not just something, oh, I'm supposed to do this. We really do it with creativity, and that's where Tsongtsen Rinpoche, he's been very encouraging to say, don't necessarily be stuck just trying to do it how it's traditionally done, but do it really with your own heart and your own inspiration. So, traditionally, shrines are at the heart of the home, seen as a means to invoke the fine or sacred qualities of our existence. Yet, in the context of modern life, with the modern person's poor understanding of the sacred, shrines are often placed in more discreet places. And that, of course, is because we might be visited by friends who just think we are off with the fairies if we subscribe to something like awakening or enlightenment and so forth. So the value of the shrine. Shrine serves as a mirror, reflecting the innate awakened nature with all life. So also that's where we shouldn't think of our shrine or our Buddhist practice in general as something political. It's not about us Buddhists against non-Buddhists. It's really just about appreciating something that's common to all life. So of course not everybody might get that, but what the shrine really represents is something that's universal and doesn't stand in opposition or outside of anything. You could say cultural or familiar to anybody. It's really just connected. It really just represents the basic condition of all sentient life. Now, through the daily care of the shrine, cleaning, offering, and maintaining presence, we engage in a practice that purifies confusion, generates merit, and nurtures the conditions for awakening. Ultimately, maintaining a shrine is a tangible expression of commitment to a greater vision, to the vision of enlightenment, to the vision of the basic nature of all life, the basic nature of who we are. It reminds us that enlightenment is not distant, but always present within. So that's kind of it. And I will rejoice if any of you are practitioners and you practice the Dharma, and just say, to have a shrine in this sense then is something that is very much a possibility of expressing the beauty and the goodness that's basic to the nature of the Buddhist path that we're practicing. So thank you for listening thus far, and with all the very best wishes. Take care.